So daily life during the Civil War was a major part of the Southern existence. Of course, Northern people would be impacted by daily life during the war as well because men were being drafted. But since the majority of the war was fought in the South, those people are going to have a significantly different perspective on daily life during the war. So conscription was a pretty major thing. This is a fancy word that means to be drafted, and both sides are going to eventually have to have a conscription law. Both sides initially drafted men between 18 and 35, but in the North, they could pay a fee to avoid the draft, or they could even hire a substitute. In addition to that, due to a steady stream of immigrants, particularly the Irish, many of their soldiers were immigrants who were literally fresh off the boat. Like they had an enlistment station at the docks where people were coming into New York so that they could enlist these people. And these people were willing to enlist not because they believed in the fight, but because they would get paid. In the South, again, they also drafted men in the 18 to 35-year-old age range. However, because they did not have that steady stream of immigrants after the first year of the war, they're going to have to raise that age to 45. And by the end of the war, they're going to be drafting males between 17 and 50. Now, you could get out of fighting in the South as well. They had the 20 slave law. A person could send 20 slaves to fight for them if they didn't want to fight. Some of them might choose to fight anyway, as well as send slaves to fight. It was very, quote unquote, patriotic from the Southern perspective to fight for the Confederacy. And once the war gets started, whether you wanted to or not, you're going to have to pick a side because most of the war will be fought in the South. And so you're literally going to have battles in your yard or on your farmland. So this war is mostly fought by lower class. Of course, you had wealthy people on both sides fighting because they saw it as their duty. But overall, because you could get out of fighting if you owned 20 or more slaves or you could hire someone, then you obviously had money. Confederate money was a big thing in the South, and a really stupid thing. To show their patriotism, people would get rid of their US dollars, their greenbacks, and switch it to Confederate money. And basically, this money had a pretty picture on it, and that's it. It had zero value. It would be like trying to pay with Monopoly money. They didn't have any gold to give it value, so they're still in the gold standard at this time, and the amount of gold you had dictated how much your money was worth. The Confederate government didn't have any, and so this is worthless money. And so when the war is over, most of these people are bankrupt. And then you add to that the blockade is really, really increasing the prices on things. You have that major inflation occurring, and that just continues to cause problems. And again, it's going to be a problem for a little while after the war as well, because a lot of these people didn't have U.S. money to spend, and the Confederate money is worthless. So women are one of the major groups impacted by the Civil War. They had to take on many roles that were not normal for them. So most women had zero skills. They were not trained to have a job. Of course, they could read and write. They would have some basic medical knowledge. They could do math and that kind of thing, but they had not been trained to have a job. They had been trained to run a house. So they're going to take on some jobs that were not normal for them, although most of them will just run the house. So you did have women serving as spies, like Harriet Tubman for the Union, Rose O'Neal Greenhow for the South. At this time, a detective agency opened called the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and it ran the majority of the Union spies. They also provided the Secret Service officers for Abraham Lincoln to keep him safe, as well. Some soldiers did that as well. But Alan Pinkerton, was a man who had actually discovered the first assassination attempt before Lincoln was even inaugurated, and prevented that from happening. So he was really popular. And then nursing was another big one. Now, this could be done in multiple ways. You had women like Clara Barton and other women like her that signed up and actually began nursing soldiers at the battles. Or you had women, particularly Southern women, who are, being impacted by these battles because maybe it's being fought in your backyard. And they're going to help provide nursing attention on the sides of those battlefields. But once the battle is over and the people have moved on, they stay at their house. These are called wayside hospitals. They pop up on the edge of battlefields as well as in railroad stations and train cars. And again, for the most part, these are women in the South who are caring for wounded soldiers to keep them alive long enough to get them to a quote unquote real hospital or a place that has more dedicated nursing or medical services. Another way that women impacted the war was by fighting as soldiers. An estimated 400 women served as soldiers disguised as men. Some of them made it all the way through the war without being discovered. Others, were called after they were injured. Of course, they were not punished in any way. They just were sent home or given the opportunity to take on a different role within the Army, maybe as cooks or nurses or whatever. But they weren't in trouble. But the majority of women did stay home. They had to run plantations or a family business, whatever it was that their husband normally was responsible for. They're going to have to take on that job in addition to their jobs as women. They're going to care for the children and slaves if they had any. They're going to have to make substitutes or learn to do without certain products that are unavailable due to the blockade. They're going to flee their homes as the Union advanced when Sherman marched through the state. The South is going to lose a very large portion of their population. And so you have a large number of women widowed, usually with children to care for. And again, I mentioned they don't have any skills that would allow them to get a job. So they're going to have to figure out, different things they can do. Some of them will move west. Some of them will, have to learn that skill and open a business or, get a job doing whatever they can. Some women did actually accompany their husbands because they felt it was safer to live in camp with them. And you can see in this photograph, you have a woman who has accompanied her husband and their 3 kids, and she is earning her keep, so to speak, by doing laundry for the soldiers. And so that way she could be fed with military food, as could her kids. They would probably help out doing some things like gathering firewood, running errands, that kind of thing. African Americans, of course, were very heavily impacted by the war in many ways. So in the South, many are going to flee to fight for the Union. This was fairly easy to do in certain areas of the South because the Union controlled certain areas. And instead of having to make it all the way up to the North to be free, they just had to make it to one of those Union-held areas. Others are going to wait on the plantations for Union troops to come and be set free. And then some will have to fight for the Confederacy. They were sent in place of their master and they didn't have a choice. And that's kind of what had happened to Robert Smalls. And he eventually obtained his freedom by stealing that boat. But others are going to stay with the Confederacy the whole time until the war is over. Of course, up north, African Americans are going to enlist to fight as well. And they'll end up in the South to fight against the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation was a document issued by Abraham Lincoln in September of 1862, and it went into effect on January 1st, 1863. It freed the slaves in the rebelling states only. Okay, so it did not actually apply to the border states. However, the border states stood in solidarity with the North and freed their slaves at the same time. So it's an interesting document because it's a perspective. So the North is going to recognize this. And in all areas of the South that are held by the Union, they will recognize this as well. But in the areas held by the South, this has no legal value. They are under a different government. And so they're not going to recognize this document. They're also, if they capture African Americans in battle, they're going to assume that they're slaves and put them back into slavery, even if they were free. That's what they're going to say. And so it is a perspective, and it's also why the constitutional 13th Amendment is going to be needed after the war. The final group to be impacted were children. Boys as young as 10 enlisted to fight. Most of them are going to serve as drummer boys and flag bearers. However, it was still very dangerous for them. They are on the edge of the battlefield. They could be shot. Just not a really great situation, but many of them, could have been orphans, and this was a way for them to get out of that situation. Many of them just wanted to show their support for their side. Most children stayed at home. They worked on the family plantation or farm, particularly in the South. They're going to have to grow up real fast. Schooling will be cut short for many. There's not only more of an emphasis on survival, particularly in the South, but in this time period, most teachers were men. And so unless there was an older man in the area that could teach, or they had a female that they were willing to allow to teach, then they just didn't get schooling. There's going to be a lot of them left orphaned. Generally, what goes along with war is a spread of disease. When you have a lot of people in close proximity like that, and they're living in not great conditions, you're going to have more sickness, and then it's going to pass to the people they come into contact with. So it was very possible to lose a father to a battle and a mother to a disease and be left orphaned. But for some of them, their father returned and their mother survived, but the father could no longer support the family. Maybe he had lost a limb or two. Maybe he had what we would now call PTSD. They didn't know what that was at that time, but maybe he was experiencing those types of things and couldn't work, which means somebody else is going to have to step up and take over that work. And so you did have kids both in the North and the South being forced to take jobs at young ages in not great conditions to try to keep their family alive. The war finally ended on April 9th, 1865, in a town called Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. This was after a battle in the same place. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. Now, fighting doesn't officially stop until June in Texas. However, because you have Robert E. Lee, who's considered the main general for the South, and Ulysses S. Grant, considered the main general of the Union, together, this is considered the official ending. They know it's just a matter of time before the rest of the army and Jefferson Davis are going to have to surrender. Over 700,000 men had died in the fighting, and a good portion of those people were from the South. And it's going to cause some issues for several generations of there not being enough men and way too many females. And then about a week after that, on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and an actor who actually received mail in that theater and, had acted in that theater. He didn't appear to be out of place, went in there and used a pistol to shoot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. He was carried across the street to a boarding house. He would have actually survived the gunshot wound. However, the doctors kept sticking their dirty fingers in the bullet hole, trying to get to the bullet, and he got an infection, and it killed him. And so he died in the morning on April 15th, 1865. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, was sworn in as president, setting the stage for a very different Reconstruction from the one envisioned by Lincoln. Lincoln was wont to be lenient, which was a good thing. He was going to punish them, don't get me wrong, but he was going to do it in a more lenient way, which probably in the long run would have worked better. Johnson was a Southerner. He was very racist. He did not like African Americans at all. And he was a Southerner who was not from the wealthy class. And so he was very resentful of the wealthy people. This is going to lead him to be very, very petty and strict with the punishment. And it's going to cause the Southerners to be very angry. And they're going to lash out at the people they consider the weaker ones, which are going to be the African Americans. So it's going to lead to punishment directed towards the African Americans that possibly could have been avoided if Lincoln had remained president. But John Wilkes Booth was a Southern sympathizer. He supported the Confederacy. And, he did this very intentionally.